Disembodied voice you're probably hearing off to the side here. My name's Stuart. I'm the curator of the Cromwell Museum, so it's my great privilege to look after this remarkable collection of artefacts here in Huntingdon, which is the world's best collection of artefacts relating to Oliver Cromwell, who, of course, Huntingdon's most famous son, some might say infamous, depending on your point of view, one of the most significant and indeed also controversial figures in British history. Whether you love him or hate him, you really can't ignore him. So this wonderful programme of talks that we do twice a year is always a way of bringing in experts to give us different viewpoints about Cromwell and his story. And we can think of one of the few people more experts than our guest this evening, who is Professor John Morrill of the University of Cambridge. John, I mean, as now is most of you, he's one of our academic advisors. He's written extensively on Cromwell for most of his career, and of course, most recently has been the general editor of the amazing 3-volume copies of Cromwell's Letters and Speeches, of which we very proudly have a set on my shelves just over there, and very well thumbed it is as well. As many of you will know, this year is Cromwell's 425th birthday, effectively, and therefore, when thinking about who we could get to talk about Cromwell and his early career, I really couldn't think of anybody more qualified to talk about it and sort of set the context for Cromwell and his early life and what we do and don't know about it than John Morrill. So, John, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I will put up your presentation and we can then go from there.
Well, that allegedly is our hero as a small child. What I thought would be most useful, I think it's actually maybe something that Stuart originally suggested to me, was that to look at those things in his early life which helped to make sense of his later life. So what's he brought up to expect? What are the strengths and weaknesses that he develops in the first 40 years of his life before his public bursting onto the public scene, really, with the calling of the Parliament of 1640. Risen from obscurity, indeed. What I'm not going to deal with, I did begin by drawing a list of all the stories told in the early biographies. Biographies are rather a misnomer, all the early things with titles like Flagellum, the stories about him stealing apples, being stolen by monkeys or carried by monkeys onto the roof of his uncle's house, been having a debauched time as an undergraduate in Cambridge. You might think that's all too plausible. Even stories of him being at the Christmas festivities at his uncle's house, where a Lord of Misrule was appointed and people were supposed to misbehave, but he misbehaved by besmirching himself in poo and causing a great stench. Well, all these stories are obviously made to make him, to belittle him at the time of his greatness and after his death. Of all the stories that are told about him in those early biographies by James Heath's Flagellum and so on, the only one which attracts me as having some truth in it is that when the young Prince Charles, the future Charles I, followed his father down to London in a few months after James VI of Scotland had become James I of England, that he stopped at Hinchingbrook, and this is true, he did stop at Hinchingbrook, and that the uncle invited his young nephew to come and play with the prince, Oliver being a few months older than the prince. They fell out over a toy and Oliver punched Prince Charles on the nose. And that was the first time the only time they're known to have met before the final denouement in 1647, 48 and 49. Now, I'm not sure I believe that he punched Prince Charles on the nose, but the idea that he would have been invited by his uncle to meet the little prince when the little prince was visiting Hinchingbrook, just outside Huntingdon in 1640, that sounds entirely plausible to me. And in fact, there is some suggestion that when James made one of his many visits, I think it's 15 visits to Huntingdon to hunt, but on 2 occasions he brought little, well, increasingly, well, he's always small, isn't he, Charles? He brought Charles with him. So they may well have met a number of times in childhood. And that's sort of relevant to my theme, because Cromwell is living a life which is always tantalizingly close to, but not fully established in the upper realms of political and social life. And that insecurity is one of the things that I want to talk about. So we're going to go through the various aspects of his life down to 1640, which are freighted, I think, with possible future explanations. So perhaps if we look at the next slide, it's important this on the slide so you can really get our heads around it. Oliver Cromwell was the eldest surviving son of the younger son of a knight. He was lucky, I mean, in terms of getting anything in life, being the surviving son, if his elder brother had survived, he would have become probably, if he was lucky, apprenticed and served out an apprenticeship. He certainly wouldn't have been a property owner unless he'd made a great success of whatever probably local trade that he was trained in. But his elder brother died and he becomes the heir to his father. Now his father had been slightly less lucky. His elder brother had survived, so he had not inherited the Cromwell properties, which of course had been themselves the result of a marriage back in the 1530s to the House of Cromwell, and we'll come on to that in just a minute. But Cromwell, because his uncle has his main residence throughout his childhood a mile or so away, just outside the town, and therefore the likelihood that Oliver and his father were frequent visitors to the house where the king was visiting regularly on the Great North Road, where the great and the good were coming up and down from the north of England or even from Scotland and stopping off on their way, that he was rubbing his nose against the pane of the window, looking in at the great and the good and being almost part of it, but not quite. Now, what a sociologist would call this is that he was a man with a low level of status crystallization. Perhaps another way of putting it, he had a confused social identity. And everyone says he was born as a gentleman, but that, of course, is very marginal. You know, he's a gentleman because his grandfather's a knight. He's not a gentleman by virtue of his own wealth. I mean, they don't, the Cromwells, his father, doesn't own much in the way of freehold property. He owns the right to collect tithes, to administer the estates of the church that had come down from dissolved monasteries. I mean, he's an urban figure, not a rural figure. So he's a gentleman as a sort of gesture, but he's not a real gentleman. He's not living the lifestyle of a gentleman. And of course, as we'll see in the 1630s, it gets worse because he becomes a working farmer. He becomes a yeoman. And at that point, he would have lost the fact he's working with his hands, he's working the land, meant he'd ceased to be a gentleman. And then he regains status as his wealth goes up at the end of 1630s. So a low level of status crystallization or confused social identity. And it's very important we start with that, because I think there are insecurities of social identity and inferiority complexes that we can see as playing a role in his later life. So let's look a bit more at that inheritance. So I hope we can sort of that. If you're looking on your phone, you're in out of luck with this slide, but if you're looking on a screen, you should be all right. It all goes back, of course, to the fact that a Welshman called Morgan Williams married the sister of Thomas Cromwell before he was great. And that, of course, was a very fortunate marriage. Thomas Cromwell himself had a very complicated background and a very complicated early manhood, very mysterious. But of course, from the late 1520s, he is just whizzed up through the social order to become the Earl of Essex, and of course, for several years, the chief minister of Henry VIII, and through that, the beneficiary of a huge amount of wealth, some of which he passed on to his sister and his brother-in-law, who, out of deference to this, takes the name of Cromwell from Thomas Cromwell, but the name is really Williams. And all the Cromwells, including Oliver, continue to use the word Williams as their surname on legal documents, because legally you can't change your name by deed poll. So being called Cromwell alias Williams, or even Williams alias Cromwell, becomes the form for this main branch of the family, for Cromwell's father and for Cromwell himself. And in fact, in the 1650s and 1660s, some of the family revert to Williams and drop Cromwell altogether for, again, obvious reasons. It's a big family. Richard Williams Cromwell, who is the child of, or nephew of Thomas Cromwell, and then Sir Henry, have many children. Cromwell's grandfather, Sir Oliver, has 4 sons and 4 daughters who live to adulthood. I've got there, Sir Oliver is the older one, Robert Cromwell is the second son. So Cromwell has a lot of aunts. He's got 5 aunts, all of whom make important marriages, and quite a lot of those names in that list, if you can see it in the middle of the screen, will mean something to some of you. Whoops.
That's all right. No, ignore it.
No, I tried to see. Yeah, better look what is underneath that. Yeah. So you've got Sir Thomas Barrington, William Hampden, the father of John Hampden, Richard Whalley, William Dunch, and Thomas Fleming. Now, some of those are going to play an important part in Cromwell's own story. Robert Cromwell marries Elizabeth Stewart. That's to say, someone who actually is a rather wealthier version of Robert Cromwell himself. That's to say, someone who is the administrator of estates for the Cathedral of Ely, but again, someone whose property is as it were, administering ecclesiastical revenues, or farming ecclesiastical revenues. We'll say a little bit more about the contacts through the stewards as we go on. Robert Cromwell has 3 sons, of whom Oliver is the second and only surviving son, and then 7 daughters. So Cromwell has 7 sisters. So Cromwell has 5 aunts, 7 sisters, and then of course he goes on to have 4 daughters. The family is very much dominated by women, and one of the things which interests me in doing the edition of his writings is that Cromwell seems to me to be much more comfortable writing to women than he does to men. He opens up about the inner man much more, and that includes, incidentally, his 2 daughters-in-law, as well as his daughters, his aunts, and his sisters. And you can see, if you glance down, that creates a very large network, which in the biography I'm writing, I'm going to make a great deal of, because it turns out they act very much as a phalanx in politics, and that however much they may have not been entirely in line during the Civil War, they're utterly in line during the Commonwealth and Protectorate. So if we move on beyond that, I mean, you might want me to talk a bit more about some of those people, but I think again the names will seem pretty familiar to you. Cromwell lives with his mother until he is in his 50s. He lives with his wife until he dies for 37 years, I suppose. and his sisters, many of his sisters and his daughters live with him until they get married. Many of them after his Lord Protector, both sisters and daughters getting married after he's become Protector. His sons either die very young or they go off to school when they're 7. The Cromwell household in Huntingdon and then in St Ives and then in Ely, that's right down to the outbreak of Civil War, is overwhelmingly a female household. And I think those these are 3 key figures: his mother, his wife, and his Auntie Joan Barrington. And she's there because it's quite clear that she is the key figure in arranging the marriages for the whole of the Cromwell dynasty. Joan is his aunt, his father's sister. It's almost certain to me that she's the one who arranged Cromwell's own marriage, but she also arranges other marriages. And I'm going to talk about one of those in some detail a little bit later on. But the Barringtons, who Cromwell is extremely close to, the Barringtons living in Hatfield Broadoak in Essex, are amongst his closest friends in the 1640s, even though they're not politically completely aligned. Those are very close. There's a great deal of close family connection between them. So let's move on to the next one, because time rushes by. I thought everybody watching this must know what the school looks like. So I didn't do that, but I showed him a near contemporary map of Huntingdon, which does show, it shows within the close proximity of where he lives, where he goes to church, and where his schoolhouse is. The schoolhouse, of course, one of the reminders that the family's wealth is based on former monastic lands. He's in a former monastic building. All the child's property derives from the uncles entirely from it. Now, I overlooked one thing I was going to say a bit earlier, so slightly disorganizedly. Let me just bring one other thing in. This question of the ambiguity of his social position, I think it is clear that he becomes very preoccupied with his ancestry. It's one of the ways of securing if his own identity is a bit confused and the family's isn't. Now you might think, but Morgan Williams was a self-made man. But Morgan Williams could trace or could claim to trace his origins back to the princes of Powys and effectively to the rulers of Wales. And in 1602, when Oliver is 3, his grandfather has a very elaborate pedigree drawn up, which traces the Cromwell family back to the rulers of Wales. And Cromwell's Welshness is another thing we need to pay close attention to. Of course, the name's Williams itself. We know that in the windows at Hinchingbrook, when he ever went to see his uncle, he would see the devices of this Welsh royal ancestry. We know he has a copy made of this document, which he keeps at Hampton Court in the 1650s. It's very important to him. And Lloyd Bowen has shown in a really outstanding essay, I think, that Cromwell remains incredibly close to Wales. When he acquires significant property as a result of his earnings as a general in the Civil War, he takes the lands in Wales. He becomes a major landowner in Wales. He takes and has a natural affinity, or chooses to have an affinity, with Welsh when he comes across men like Philip Jones, who serves on his Council of State in the 1650s, but had become his business manager of his estates in Wales. John Jones, another man he'd met, who comes into the family, is married into the family in the 1650s. And anyone with Welsh identity is liable to be treated quite generously by him. There's an amazing letter to the Archbishop of York, John Williams, who actually he crossed swords with in the 1630s when, as Bishop of Lincoln, he had been involved with what was happening in the church in St Ives, which we'll come back to. But he hails John Williams. Any evidence whatsoever, he must be my cousin because he's called Williams. He doesn't say you must be my cousin because but he calls him his cousin, and the only reason he could possibly have done that, and he reaches out to give him some favours that John Williams, the Archbishop of York, who was having problems with the man who'd taken over from him in Conway, and he reaches out to him. Welshness is very important, and we'll come back to that again a bit later on. So there he is. He's at school here in the old medieval hospital building in Huntingdon, and then he goes on to Sydney, Sussex. In both those cases, there's some evidence of an uneasy time. His schoolmaster in Huntingdon, Thomas Beard, apart from being a notoriously violent man in terms of the use of the cane, is someone he came to obstruct in every possible way in the 1630s. At Sydney, Sussex, he goes up in 1616. It's a very strange thing. Nobody's asked, why did he go to Sydney, Sussex? All his family had been to Queen's. I mean, all the main branch of the family. His own father had been at Queen's. So Queen's would have been the obvious place to go, but he doesn't go to Queen's. He has friends at Queen's, including Oliver St John, who he certainly knew from his undergraduate days, and more on that in a second. But why Sydney, Sussex? Now, my guess is this. Sydney, Sussex is 20 years old. Queen's has been there since the 14th century. The fees at Sydney, Sussex were a lot cheaper than the fees at Queen's. The Cromwells of Huntingdon were not well off. In order to have the status of a gentleman, he needed to be a fellow commoner and not a servitor. So if he was going to actually keep the claim to having a higher social standing good, he had to go to somewhere where he could be a fellow commoner, and that meant he had to go somewhere cheap. Now, there's a very interesting thing which happens. One of the conditions on which for fellow commoners, he had to provide a significant piece of silver to the college as a gift on his admission. And the Cromwells stump up what would for them have been a significant amount of money to buy some tableware in silver. Cromwell, of course, is only there for 12 months because of his father's death. He probably only had been there for 2 years anyway, because gentlemen don't complete their degrees. They have a veneer of polite learning and move on. But he was only there for 1 year, and then he left. A year after he left, Sydney decided to buy a bit of additional land, and they need to raise some cash to do it, and they flog off the bits of silver that they didn't think were particularly significant, and they flogged off the significant piece of silver presented by the Cromwell with the family crest on it. And I think he bore a grudge about that. And you can see in the 1640s, when he's based in Cambridge, he has the master of the college, the master had been there when he was there, arrested for royalist activity. It was very mild royalist activity, but actually being fairly neutral. But he does him no favours, and when he could have stayed in his old college, he prefers not to stay in his old college. So I think there's no legacy of goodwill towards the institution, but it's very interesting that people whose connections with him you can't make much sense of, like some of the Lancashire parliamentarians, had been his fellow students. I've been going through the matriculation registers across the university for 1616, and suddenly you see a pattern that once you were matriculating somebody, you know, they were friends for life. Those of you who've been to a Cambridge college or an Oxford college know that you either hate someone for life or you love them for life. And I think there are webs of connection there with some Presbyterian ministers with some quite Presbyterian politicians who get a very easy ride in the 1640s because they've been at college with him. And that loyalty that's by blood and loyalty by association is something that he treats, and of course is one of the marks of a gentleman. So here he is, and with some of these themes working his way through. But he has to leave, or chooses to leave, when he's just coming up to his 18th birthday because of his father's death, in order to help with the take over from his father. He's just old enough for them not to have wardship, and he takes over, and he has a household of women to look after him. And fairly soon afterwards, he gets married in London. And again, there are interesting questions about why they get married in London. I couldn't help resist saying, if you didn't know, that where Cromwell was married, Milton was buried. And it's reconstructed after the Germans had made a fair mess of it. This is Giles Cripplegate, of course, in the Barbican, the heart of the Barbican. But the 1545 plans were used for reconstruction of it, and it's a good place to visit if you are in central London. Now, the obvious reason, I suppose, for getting married with Giles Cripplegate is the family into which he marries, the Bouchers or the Bourgier, depending on your preferred pronunciation. These London merchant family, 2 generations deep really, of fur traders and general merchants, who'd made enough money to be able to retire to the countryside. It's interesting that Cromwell's new father-in-law had been knighted by James I on the same day as Cromwell's grandfather, Oliver. So there's a kind of little bit connections there. They have settled in Essex, the Bourgiers or Bouchers, and I would put good money, given where they live. I'd be good money on Joan Cromwell, Barrington being the person who brought them together. The web of connection between the Barringtons and the gentry of that part of Essex are very strong. So Joan Barrington's looking to get a good marriage for her nephew, who's on the margins of being able to sustain his gentility, and this is a good marriage and a profitable one from the family's point of view. Okay, right. So, okay, we'll leave that up as a temptation, just while I run through some other things that I don't need to screen. So he's essentially a local man for the first 40 years of his life. He lives in Huntingdon until 1631, 1632. In the 1620s, he's not only earning, I don't know, perhaps £200 a year, which puts him again really on the for that east of England, very much on the margins of gentility. But with the worry, if his family's honour is to be maintained, the honour of a gentleman is concerned, he's got to find good marriages with dowries for all his sisters and prospectively for his daughters. He's making his way. He's quite highly rated in the subsidy rolls. Subsidy rolls don't do anything about wealth, but they do tell you about relative wealth. People don't want to be paying less tax than people who are below them in the social scale. So when Cromwell's position in paying tax does entitle him to see himself as someone who should be involved in local government, and as far as we can see, he is sometimes at least elected in the annual elections as a councilman for the town, and he holds some other fairly insignificant local offices in what is to be honest, a fairly insignificant town in the 1620s, maybe a county town, but it's pretty small. It's not a serious town. And so life seems to, and in fact, for the 20s, you can't see the web of of connection beyond Huntingdon, which are going to be very strong in the 1630s. You can't see them, being very prominent in the 1620s. So he reaches his 30th birthday as very much a minor figure in a minor town. And things are not looking any better for him, because the expense of entertaining the king 15 times with all his entourage, let alone all the people coming up and down the Great North Road in a bid to catch the eye of government and perhaps get a government position, had caused the Cromwell, the senior branch, to get into serious financial difficulties. They sell the big house on the Great North Road and they retire to the other great monastic house, the two great monastic houses they had at Ramsey, and retreat to Ramsey, leaving, as it were, the patronage of the senior branch gone. So Cromwell's now on his own, without the patronage. I think as one of the kind of goodwill gestures in 1628, just at the time when the Montagues, great legal financial dynasty from London, are taking over at Hinchingbrook, they allow Cromwell to be take the junior seat for the city of Huntingdon in the 1628 Parliament, where he makes very little impact. I think that's a kind of goodwill gesture. There's no way he's going to get elected for Huntingdon again, not least once he's alienated the Montagues and their agents. So at the end of the 1620s, we can be pretty certain that financially things are very strained indeed. We can certainly know that with the removal of his uncle, his position in local government is increasingly insecure. And we're pretty certain that at that point, the pressures on him were such that he had a nervous breakdown. He is recorded as visiting quite a prominent doctor in London, and again, one assumes it's a London doctor. It's through patrons who gets him there. Who records seeing Mr. Cromwell of Huntingdon for valde melancholicus. Well, valde melancholicus sounds to me like clinical depression, and he's treated for this. He has a breakdown, and it's almost certainly, in my view at this time, that he has a religious conversion experience, to which we'll return in a little while. There is an alternative view that it was later. I personally can't see why. It seems to be very obvious it is now. So he has a breakdown, and in the course of that breakdown, he has a major political disaster locally, because the Montagues, this thrusting, successful court family, think Huntingdon is a backward place and it's completely behind the times because it's democratic. What sort of efficient organisation has annual elections? We should have a properly constituted oligarchy of the great and the good. Let's get a new charter from the king. And so they get a new charter from the king, which is going to make Huntingdon, more up to date and oligarchic. And Cromwell's omitted from the governing group. He's now pushed us out, and he then publicly criticises the mayor, who the first mayor after the new charter comes in, and the new recorder of the town, legal officer of the town, who is so much in the pocket of the Earl of Manchester that when his next child is born, he's baptised in All Saints here with the name Manchester Bernard. So they're clearly very close. So Cromwell publicly criticised them, and the result is the Montagues report him to the Privy Council. This is a kind of petty treason. And Cromwell's hauled up to London and is dressed down by the Privy Council. And another member of the Montague family is made to write a report on it. He said he must make a public apology on market day. So Cromwell has to stand in the marketplace and make a humiliating apology. So his honour is now shot. So he's really in a bad place, and he just decides that this town is no longer the place to be. So he sells up all the inheritance, he sells it all out, and he becomes a working farmer in St Ives. and moves away. It's possible, it's probable they kept the townhouse, I think. I think the mother may have stayed there for a while, but he moves to St Ives to a farmhouse. And in the 1630s, in terms of local things, there's a sighting of him with a red flannel around his neck with his terrible bronchitis. And we note at that stage he gets the form of malaria that is quite common in the Fenland in England in the 17th century, and that's another legacy that will haunt him, because if malaria comes back at critical moments, particularly times of stress in the 1640s and 1650s. So there are legacies of this period. But he's through the worst because he's now discovered his religious faith and his religious future. He's had another row with the town because a Huntingdon-born man called Richard Fishbourne had left £2,000, a really significant bequest to the town. There's been a major row over how to spend it, and Cromwell's on the losing side. We don't need to go into that particularly at the moment. But he goes off, and he has very little to do with Huntingdon really until dramatically summer of 1642. Right, how are we doing for time? Are we,
Yeah, it's okay.
I'm just on. I am on time. Good. In Huntingdon, there is Andrew Barclay, who's one of the other editors of the Cromwell edition, has brilliantly, I think, reconstituted the fact that Cromwell is attending and possibly actually preaching at a conventicle, an illegal underground church in St Ives in the 1630s, which was having enormous importance for him in lots of ways. So he's pulling his life together, but he is a working farmer. And I want to just remind you of that when we come to the second of the two letters I'm going to examine in just a minute. Alongside all that, though, there are this web of contacts which take him into a bigger world than the world of Huntingdon. There's the web of connection which we can only partially reconstitute into Essex. The contact with a number of families, and we'll look at this in just a moment. There's the web of connection through his in-laws, the Bouchers or Bouchiers. There's contacts with Felsted, where he sends his children to school, 4 boys to school. There's contact with the Barringtons through his aunt Joan, and there's ongoing contact which we know about because he uses him for family business. The rising attorney Oliver St John, the friend from Cambridge, who is signing documents for him, which are in the Huntingdon Record Office right next door in the late 1620s and into the 1630s. And St John is to be an important ally for the rest of his life. So there was the Essex connection, and the Essex connection is to be again very important in the way he wages war in East Anglia in the first half of the 1640s. And then there's the London connection. During this row over the Fishbourne bequest, he forms close links with the London Mercers Company. It can be found all over the records of London Mercers Company, again through remote relatives by marriage, as being part of that. Now let's put some more flesh on this more interesting side of him, which shows he's not confined to being just a worthy of East Anglia, or of Huntingdon and St Ives, and then of course through the death of his mother's brother, inheriting a rather more substantial ecclesiastical portfolio, administering tithes and estates for the farmer of tithes and estates for the Cathedral at Ely. I wish we knew more about that. I wish the records really showed us more. There's a very intriguing thing in which Bishop Wren, the most hardline of the Laudian bishops, he scribbles on the bottom of a document which is within the diocesan archives, "Tell Mr. Cromwell I am ready for him." Now, what's the tone of voice? Is it, "Tell Mr. Cromwell I'm ready for him. I've got his number. I know what's going on." Or is it, "Oh, can you tell Mr. Cromwell I'm ready for him? Can you come and tell me how those tenants are doing that have been misbehaving?" You don't know. You can't tell. It's very frustrating. Right. Let's move on to the last part of the talk, really, which is about a detailed account of 2 letters. Now, I want to use this also as an illustration of how complicated editing Cromwell is. Just how many intriguing things you can solve. If you don't think about what you're editing, then it's easy. If you think about what you're editing, it's very complicated. So let's have a look at the first of 2 letters that Cromwell wrote in the second half 1630s. To my very loving friend, Mr. Story, at the sign of the dog in the Royal Exchange, London, these. So who on earth is Mr. Story? What on earth is the sign of the dog? And why is Cromwell writing to the Royal Exchange? Well, 20 odd years ago, was it? Perhaps 30 years ago, I wrote saying that this must be George Story, because you're London Mercer, and Cromwell's links with the Mercer's company. He's a friend of Edward Bass, who's mentioned in the letter. And he recently departed from London for Massachusetts. And we know that because he gets involved in a feud over a missing pig in Massachusetts. And that's why he wasn't doing what Cromwell was accusing him of not doing in the letter. But there's another possibility. Robert Story, a linendraper, who was a neighbour of Bass, in the same street as Bass, and he came from Chesterton in Cambridge, so he's sort of East Anglian. But what Andrew Barclay concluded he must be right when he was editing this letter for the edition is this must be James Story, who was a haberdasher and an exchange man. That's to say, he worked in the exchange, the Royal Exchange. Originally from St Ives, where his father, a tailor, still lived. James leased a manor close to St Ives, now run by his brother. And he's also connected to the brother or nephew of Cromwell's mother's first husband. Well, I'm not going to try and explain how that works, but he is a relative of a sort. So I think it is James' Story that who, and the letter is going to him. So what's in the letter, and what do we deduce by the tone of the letter? Okay. Building of hospitals provides for men's bodies. To build of material temples is judged a work of piety. But they that procure spiritual food, they that build up spiritual temples, they are men truly and truly charitable, truly pious. The land is there, should be there. Truly charitable, truly pious. Such a work as this was your erecting the lecture in our country, and over then changed to in the which you placed Dr. Wells, a man of goodness and industry and ability to do good every way, not short of any I know in England. So here is Mr. Story, who's helped to set up a lectureship, that's to say a preaching ministry. This is very great work. It's great work because you are providing spiritual food, you're building up spiritual temples, and this is a very good thing. And you've procured for it Dr. Wells, who is a graduate of Dutch University, so a good, really strong Calvinist. And so who is Dr. Wells? Because I can't find him in Huntingdon anywhere. But let's go on. And surely, Mr. Story, it were a piteous thing to see a lecture fall in the hands of so many able and godly men, as I'm persuaded the founders of this are, in these times wherein we see they are suppressed with too much haste and violence by the enemies of God, his truth. That's the bishops. So Cromwell is saying the bishops are the enemies of God's truth. Far be it that so much guilt should stick to your hands, who live in a city so renowned for the clear shining of the gospel. You know, Mr. Story, to withdraw the pay is to let fall down the lecture, for who goeth to war at his own cost. That's an extraordinary tone to tell with a prominent London businessman. If you're a yeoman farmer in the van, he's chiding him. He's really applying moral pressure to him. And he's applying moral pressure because he thinks this lectureship is very important in promoting Puritan truth. And now Story has pulled out. So it's a very remarkable letter in my view. And Dr. Wells, I say, where was Dr. Wells? I should have added, he's in Godmanchester. Now, those of you who know this area know that Godmanchester is basically the twin town of Huntingdon. It's immediately over the river. As it happens, it's over the river into another county and into another diocese. So we're moving from the Diocese of Lincoln to the Diocese of Ely. And so this is an extraordinary letter, and it certainly shows that Cromwell, in a letter that's going to be lying around at the sign of the dog in the exchange, that the sign of the dog obviously is an inn in the exchange, it's going to be lying around, he picks up and he's saying the enemies of the bishops, the enemies of God's truth, people losing their ears for less than that. So this is a bold letter, and a very powerful letter in which he's showing no fear or favour, and he's really going after someone we don't know what the outcome is. It was easier to work out the outcome if I'd been right, that it was the man who'd gone off to Massachusetts, because that would explain why he cancelled his subscription. But this guy seemed to stay around. So anyway, now then the second one, which is just as interesting, to my beloved cousin Mrs. St. John's at Sir William Masson's house called Oates in Essex, dear cousin. And then it's a post, I should say, at the very end, it's my wife's service and love presented to all her friends. Right, so the wife, this Boucher wife, wants of this circle around the St. John's and the Massons to be remembered. It takes us right into the heart of the Essex connection. But who is Mrs. St. John? There are two Mrs. St. Johns. No, he's not a bigamist, don't worry. His first wife, though, the first wife is Joanna Altham, the stepdaughter of Sir William Masson, who is a cousin, another cousin of Oliver's, being a granddaughter of Lady Joan Barrington, a Mrs. St. John, wife of no, so it was a Mrs. St. John. The first Mrs. St. John is there is a Mrs. St. John, the wife of Oliver St. John, who's buried at Romford on the 31st of December 1636. So let's assume from that this is the same Oliver St. John, but believe me, there are a lot of Oliver St. Johns. Mrs. St. John, we don't have the Christian name. There's no known St. John connection with Romford. Is it that, did she die in 1636? So the Cromwell, the lady that Elizabeth Cromwell's writing to in 1638 is the second Mrs. St. John. Elizabeth Cromwell, daughter of Cromwell's father's younger brother, so Cromwell's cousin, orphaned in 1630, aged, so can you move that? Age 13. So she's 21 by the time of the letter in 1638. She married Oliver St. John on either the 21st of June 1638 or the 21st of January 1638, which in that dating of the time is 1639. I had 100 people look at the middle thing there. Is the U or an A? You can't tell. And they marry at High Laver, which is Oates, which is where he's writing to. And a baby, Oliver St. John, buried at High Laver on the 18th of September 1638, a month before the letter. Was this boy baptized in Romford on the 4th of December 1636? Was this the same boy? So we're talking about Joan Barrington, so Joanna Altham having a baby and then dying of the complications of childbirth. But is that the first Mrs. St. John, or is it that the second Mrs. St. John only marries? Well, let's move on to the next slide. We'll see it in the next slide. Joanna Altham St. John has child baptized on the 4th of December and dies in December. Oliver St. John marries Elizabeth in High Laver in June 1638. Her own son, or her stepson, dies and is buried at high labour in September 1638, a month before the letter. That's scenario one. Scenario two, Joanna is not the woman who died at Romford, because there is another Oliver St. John. She's still alive, but dying in 1638. Her son is buried in September, and Cromwell assumes she's still alive when he writes this letter. She's dead or soon dies, and Oliver St. John marries Elizabeth at the end of January 1639. Is Cromwell writing to a woman who's lost her child and is dying, or a 21-year-old in a forced marriage who has just lost the child which forced the marriage? Right, and it's really difficult to decide, but it does make a difference whether you're writing to someone who's dying, or someone who's just lost a child and is in a loveless marriage. So let's look at the letter. I thankfully acknowledge your love in your kind remembrance to me upon this opportunity. Alas, you do too highly prize my lines and my company. I may be ashamed to own your expressions, considering how unprofitable I am, and the little mean improvement of my talent. Yet to honour my God by declaring what he hath done for my soul, in this I am confident that I will be so. Truly then this I find, that he giveth springs in a dry and barren wilderness where no water is. I live, you know where, in Meshech, which they say signifies belonging, in Kedar, which signifieth blackness. Yet the Lord forsakes me not. Though he do prolong, yet he will, I trust, bring me to his tabernacle, to his resting place. My soul is with the congregation of the firstborn. That, of course, is with Christ. The firstborn is Christ. So my soul is the congregation of Christ. I'm amongst the elect. My body rests in hope. And if here I may honour my God, either by doing or suffering, I shall be most glad. So this is a letter saying, look, let's move on to the next one. We'll do it after we've had it. You know what manner of life my life hath been. I lived in a love darkness and hated the light. I was the chief of sinners, as is true. I hated godliness, yet God had mercy on me. Oh, the riches of his mercy, praise him for me. Pray for me that he who hath begun a good work will perfect it to the day of Christ. Salute all my good friends in that family, wherever you're yet a member. So he's writing somebody saying, look, I have been saved despite, not because of who I am. I was the worst of sinners, but God chose to save me. And he can do the same with you. I mean, this is a letter, first of all, it's an incredibly important document because it talks about his own coming to faith, his own born again experience. And he's sharing it with someone to whom he is deeply attached. One of his cousins, but which one is it? Now, it reads to me much more like something written to a woman who's got herself caught in a loveless marriage. I mean, think about it. She'd been orphaned at 13, and she finishes up 7 years later in the household of Oliver St. John and becomes his wife. The overwhelming likelihood is, in my view, that Joan Barrington had arranged for this orphan to be taken in to work in the St. John household, and that either before or after the death of the Mrs. St. John, Oliver St. John had an affair with her, and that she was bearing a child, and that he found it necessary to marry her because she was so below him in social standing and in age. It's a crazy second marriage. Now, if that second marriage was because of a pregnancy, which then led to a child dying at stillbirth, then that circle is squared, and that's where we come down in the edition as the more likely of the scenarios. But you can see how interesting it is to edit, and why you need to do so much work. And I would say that there are hundreds of letters in the edition which have been researched to a level that's never been seen before. It's one of the reasons for the edition to actually contextualise the letters properly. So, but what it gets here you've got Cromwell in these two letters, not just a local man in Huntingdon waiting for something to happen, but working and developing webs of connection with people who are far more important than he is at that stage, but who are in a position to let cantilever him on to the next stage as the Civil War breaks out. And that web of connection is to be so important to him. He's always going to be conscious of dependence on those people. There's the one more slide, Stuart, was that it? Yeah. Right. Salute your husband and sister from me. He is a man, not a man of his word. He promised to write about Mr. Roth of Epping, but as yet I received no letters. Put him in mind to do what conveniency may be done for the poor cousin. I'd insisted about it. So Cromwell's writing to Mr. Roth of Epping. Who on earth is Mr. Roth of Epping? Now, if the Roth of Epping turns out to be a schoolmaster in Epping, who was responsible for teaching and getting into Christ College, Cambridge, more people could play a really important part in Cromwell's life in the 1650s, the Smithby family. Another tantalizing thing, but let me just end until I run out of time. If that letter contains 18 biblical quotations, it's a fabric of biblical quotations. There's one phrase which is not a biblical translation, biblical phrase. If here I may honour my God, either by doing or by suffering, I should be most glad. Now, for me, this is really in that letter the most important thing of all. Here he is in the Fenland, or he's just left the Fenland for Ely, but with his bronchitis and his malaria. He's had that very rough time in terms of his physical existence and financial existence, and God has come to him and saved him. And he thinks, if I may honour my God who has saved me, either by doing or by suffering. Well, he's been suffering, but he's waiting to be shown if he has a chance to do. And he's a coiled spring. And so when in 1640, in circumstances Andrew Berkeley so brilliantly outlined, he gets the chance to become MP for Cambridge precisely because of his time in the conventicle in St Ives. He gets the opportunity to be a doer, and that doer makes him either someone who grabs the opportunity in the House of Commons. It's 95 recorded speeches in the first 2 years of the Long Parliament, and then it brings him the Falcon Inn back in here in order to raise a troop of men when other people are waiting to see how things pan out. He's one of the ones. He goes off and seizes the silver, moving out of Cambridge from the colleges up to the king. I mean, if peace had broken out rather than war, he could have been hanged as a highwayman. But he's now doing. He's doing because his faith requires him to do. His gratitude to God for having saved him. And the whole of his life, both based on the religious conversion that came out of his crisis of his life in 1629-30, and the web of connection that cantilevered him up from nothing really to being a lieutenant general within 3 years, and the only man of any significance to be both an MP and a senior army officer in 1645. All that is the product of this complicated and fascinating early life that we have tried to put together for you.
Thank you very much indeed, John. I'll stop the share there with that, and we'll go back to the view of the gallery just there. Thank you so much for an amazing overview of that. If anybody would like to put kind of questions into the chat, I know a few people have done so already, and I'll go through various of the questions in a moment. John, just to sort of pick one up, just answers before we go through this. I think you and various other folk have described Cromwell as a religious radical and a social conservative. Given certainly in terms of his policies later on as sort of Lord Protector, bearing in mind all of the things you said about his concerns about his social status, can we see that sort of social conservatism sort of going back to this period? I mean, obviously we can see in terms of his religious conversion, his religious radicalism, But bearing in mind where he's come from in terms of these origins, is that an element of, you know, those ghosts of his sort of concerns about where he'd come from and his social status in his early life?
But perhaps the most obvious thing to say, I think, in relation to that is I'd rather a russet-coated captain who knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than one who is a gentleman and no more. I honour a gentleman who is so indeed. Now, the most interesting thing in the whole of editing, more or less, in editing the edition, the most fascinating thing is, what did he actually write rather than what he's always been assumed to write? If you think about it, I honour a gentleman who is so indeed. Single word, indeed, is a redundant word. It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
But if it was two words, I honour a gentleman who is so indeed, two words.
Completely changes the meaning.
Completely changes the meaning. So is it one or two? Yeah. Now, we have actually recovered for the first time for 300 years the actual original.
Gosh. Yeah.
And when you look at it, it could be either.
Oh.
I think it's two words. The trouble is, does he join his N's and his D's? I think he usually doesn't join his N's. So he normally does join his N's and his D's. So the gap there is real. Tim Wales, who's a researcher who was working on this, and is, I mean, has a fantastic understanding of handwritings and amazing ability of remembering handwriting. So he isn't convinced, and I very rarely, as it were, don't defer to him on such matters. But you see, that's so as always, you know, what you'd like to be a straightforward answer isn't. But the minute you raise the question, it doesn't make any sense to put an indeed in unless you want it to have some force. The minute you say, I honour a gentleman who in his deeds is showing that he's a godly gentleman, then it changes the meaning completely. But that notion of the russet-coated captain, of course, is the yeoman.
Yeah.
It's the man he was in the 1630s, the man who so I think there remains that. And of course there's a defence of you know, the way he throughout the Civil War was saying, we want godly men, not socially superior men. I mean, all the rows with county committees over appointing low-born men who to officer positions. Ralph Margery is the obvious one.
Yeah.
And in fact, Ralph Margery is the person he's talking about in that letter. Now, Ralph Margery isn't only someone with energy and drive and so on, he's also, of course, a sectary. But Cromwell has a major row with his commanding officer over the defence of Baptists, who the Scots were trying to get rid of. So I think it's a complicated position. There was something I was going to. I'll pick up a couple of things actually.
Yeah.
One is, did he go to the Inns of Court? There's quite a lot. There are plenty of people in reasonably good position to know who said he went to Lincoln's Inn. There's no record of him at Lincoln's Inn, and we don't, on the whole, Lincoln's Inn don't, not least because they're getting fees from them, who don't fees recorded. There's another possibility, which I've always been drawn to, which is this. In order to carry out the business of the family, he needed to know civil law, because the church courts operate on civil law, not on common law. So there are people who say he trained as a civil lawyer in London, not to be practiced as a civil lawyer, but to know enough about civil law to know that it's worth paying a lawyer to argue a case. And I suspect that he actually knew more civil law than common law. There's nothing at all in his letters or in his speeches which indicate any kind of advanced understanding of common law.
Yeah.
There is some suggestion that he knew about civil law. And of course, they know that he played probably a prominent part in setting up the trial of the king. Well, he did play a prominent part. Of course, the trial of the king is by civil law, not common law. It's a court martial. So there's no indictment of Charles. I mean, there's a charge, but there's not an indictment. The whole structure of the trial of Charles I is a Civil War trial. And one of the letters, one of the very few letters that Cromwell survived from the period between prior to purge in December 1648 and the execution and trial of the king, is a letter to Trinity Hall, kept in the Trinity Hall archives, in which Cromwell writes saying, can you, now that Dr. Duck has died, can you provide a room in Doctors' Commons, which is the Civil War place, for the civil lawyer who was to play the largest part in drawing up the charges against the king.
Mm.
So Cromwell's in contact with a man called Isaac Dorislaus.
Yeah.
And Dorislaus is, so Cromwell's moving him to London just in time to write the charge against the king. So I think Cromwell's web of connection with lawyers is much more with civil lawyers. So I don't think he went from Lincoln's Inn.
Question from Colin here. Was it unusual for households of their social strata, i.e. the Cromwells, to be dominated by women as the males of the family went away to work, study or apprenticeship?
It was, but of course it's unusual to have such a predominance of women. I mean, the fact his father, the fact he has no brothers, so he has younger sisters for the most part who have to stay at home until they marry. Many of them, well, the last one, you know, towards the end of his life, in fact, and then his daughters. I think it is unusual, and to also have with the three generations, how his mother, who's obviously a very powerful figure, have a wife deeply loyal, but her own woman. I just think that because of the needs of deference to men of a higher social status for the sensitivity that I've been given, and the need and all the issues of status and so on, he's much more frozen in his opening up. So probably the person he opens up to most, the male he opens up to most, is Oliver St. John, who is a cousin. But even then, it's not like, and you know, the number of times he writes to women asking them to do things, you know, to get their husbands to do things. I mean, the famous one is writing to Dorothy to try to make Richard, you know, a bit more godly than he is. I can't do anything with this wretched man, Richard. Can you do something?
Yeah. Yes, please reform him. He needs help.
He needs help. Yeah.
Yeah. So, a question from Howard: does the Sydney Sussex College Foundation have a significant Puritan ethos? Is there? The interesting question here is: does this influence Cromwell? Was it by teaching by the ardent Puritan Thomas Beard? My understanding is we don't necessarily know for certain that Beard was a Puritan.
No, he's more Lutheran than Calvinist. Beard's influence on Cromwell probably is he wrote a book called The Theatre of God's Judgment, which is about the apparatus of providence, of God using human events to teach you lessons. And of course, Cromwell is deeply influenced by that. Sydney Sussex is set up as a Puritan college, but Queen's is very puritanical as well. I mean, Cambridge generally, until the Laudian Revolution of 1620s, Cambridge is pretty solidly Puritan. Queen's would have no difference. I mean, the person that St. John has, Thomas Preston, you know, it becomes a really prominent figure in the Puritan movement of 1620s. So he would have, and Ward, of course, Ward wasn't his tutor. I mean, Ward was the master of the college. His own tutor isn't particularly puritanical, but he's a good solid Protestant. He's anti-Catholic, so he has a strong anti-Catholic formation. But I'm sure Sydney Sussex isn't chosen because it's more Puritan. If the family wanted to, and his father certainly isn't much of a Puritan, but the family wanted him to go to Puritan college, they'd have sent him to Emmanuel. Yeah, Emmanuel is a really hard line. It's the hard line college.
Question from Anna: do we have any evidence about how Cromwell's depression was treated?
No. No, I don't. I mean, I'm sure people do know how depression was treated. I dread to think. I doubt that there was anything very efficacious.
Yeah. Question from Dave Kellett: Cromwell was well-to-do enough to be in the train bands, or at least help finance the train bands. Have we any records of his involvement with the train bands in Huntingdon, St Ives, or Ely?
No, the records aren't very good. So it's not that we know he wasn't. It's just that we don't know he was because the records don't allow us to see.
Certainly, there we've got in the museum's collections. There's the train band muster for 1636. which is signed off by, interestingly, Viscount Mandeville, of course, the future Earl of Manchester, and by Cromwell's uncle, so Sir Oliver, but not him.
Oliver, no.
So that's the militia for the train bands for Huntingdon.
Yeah.
Question from Jordan. Hello, Jordan over in Merrand. So, questions. Gosh, too many questions as are appropriate. Fascinated by this connection you draw between his conventicle lectureship and his raising profile as a doer. Do you think his notion of a doer applies to his later favouritism of figures like John Owen and Philip Nye, who served in both military and protectorate positions?
Yes, because one of the things we can be sure about Cromwell is that he is very suspicious of clergy, just clergy. You know, I mean, I think, you know, in Ireland, I mean, famously, you know, I've put my head above the parapet here. I don't think that he is. I think he believes that Catholics should be allowed to worship freely, so long as they don't go around trying to convert people. So they should be allowed to do what they like in private. But he hates Catholic clergy, who he thinks spend their whole life preventing people getting to the truth by preventing them reading scriptures. So he says yours is a covenant with death and hell. But 12 months later, when he's dealing with Scottish Presbyterians who think only they can teach the truth and people must accept their teaching, he says yours may be a covenant with death and hell. So he's very distrustful of clerical pretension and clerical power. So the clergy he likes are ones who are doers. I mean, so they work people who are in charity. So that he can't ever put Cromwell in church, except at the marriages of his daughters after the mid 1630s. I mean, once he joins the army, all his worshipping is in army conventicles, in effect.
For him, it's about a personal relationship with God.
That personal relationship with God, and it's direct access. It's direct access, immersing yourself in the scriptures, and then the Holy Spirit will teach you what the lessons are. You don't need the intermediate. So a Catholic priest or a Laudian priest will say that they will mediate sacramental grace to you, but only they can do it. The Puritans will say we will mediate the word of God to you by explaining it to you, because unless you've been properly trained, you won't be able to make sense of the scriptures. And Cromwell says no, anyone can make access to the truth by immersing themselves in scriptures and praying it and waiting for the Holy Spirit to guide them.
Yeah. Question from Ingrid here. So this doing that he's aspiring to, it does not stretch to him becoming king. What stopped him accepting the title when striving for recognition of social position had been such an early priority?
Very, very straight. Well, of course, yes. Let me answer that and then give for the ride on it. Was he interested in being king? He's very torn. I think evidence is that that his inclination is to take the arguments for him becoming king seriously. But he needs a sign from God, it's God's will, because he makes it absolutely clear on the 21st of April 1657 that God had destroyed not only the person of the king but the office. God had destroyed monarchy, so only God could restore it. So if God sent him a sign that he wanted it to be restored, he'd be happy to be king. But then you see there are, against that, you see there are these moments when it's all a bit too after the event, but there are people who say he talked about the possibility of becoming king. The famous one is Whitlock, when he goes for, meets him in Hyde Park, and they talk, and he says, what if a man would take it upon himself to become king? And Whitlock counsels him against it, but it seems to be on his mind. I don't think Cromwell himself wanted or intended to abolish monarchy in 1649. He wanted to abolish Charles I, but he'd set it all up so that power could move to the youngest son of Charles I, and to the younger sons, because the army had implicated Charles, Prince of Wales, and James, Duke of York, they'd implicated them in the father's treasons, but they hadn't implicated Henry, who's just a teenager. And he's in their possession. He could have become a puppet king and could have been, you know, educated to be a constitutional monarch. And I'm sure the plan in Cromwell's mind in January 1649 is to put Henry on the throne. And then circumstances prevented it, and he subsequently came to think it was God's will that monarchy went.
This is the same Prince Henry who supposedly told his father on his, you know, the day before his execution, "I will be torn to pieces."
Yeah.
His dad says, "Please don't take the crown before his brothers."
Well, who knows? Who knows when they went to see you know, him, and he said, "Well, you know, I would refuse to become king." But you see, the assumption was that, faced by reality, which he'd failed to face up to for years, faced by reality, Charles would abdicate if it saved monarchy. And because Charles defies them, calls their bluff, then you see, if Charles abdicates, the scale of the reaction to the transition of power will be much less than if they execute him. And then, of course, you know, there's got the attempt to persuade people to support this transformation is far greater, and in the end, it's not. But they take a long time to abolish monarchy rather than abolishing. So when Charles is executed, they make it treason to proclaim anybody as king, but they don't abolish monarchy for several weeks. And there are loads of people, foreign ambassadors. The Scots are absolutely certain that Henry, their whole rhetoric of the Scots in the early days after the execution of Charles I, the whole rhetoric is not they're going to abolish monarchy, but you're going to put the wrong prince on the throne. Yeah. That Charles, the eldest son, must become, because in Scottish history it had always followed that line. Half the kings of England between Norman conquest and Charles I had come to the throne, although they weren't the oldest male. Whereas in Scotland it always had been. So the Scots don't envisage the possibility of abolition of monarchy, only the disruption of the legitimate succession. So Cromwell's attitude to monarchy is very complicated. In 1657, he says, I will not take up that which Providence hath destroyed and laid in the dust. I will not build Jericho again. Now that's important because Blair Worden, in a brilliant article a generation ago, Blair Worden showed that what Cromwell gets very obsessed by, and this is homilies from some of these people we were talking about before, the homily which said the reason why you failed with this huge enterprise of capturing Hispaniola and the heart of the Spanish Empire, the failure of that expedition was a judgment by God upon you for your sins, and your sin was the sin of Acon, the sin of pride. And you know, God had caused the walls of Jericho to fall down, and then the Achan, the general in the army, had put the abominable thing, the idol of gold, and hidden it. And so the Israelites start losing battles rather than winning them. And Cromwell thinks that his pride is in the way, and that means his ambition was why God was now judging him. So when he says, I will not take up that which Providence hath destroyed, laid in the dust, I will not build Jericho again, he's saying, I cannot do it because God has not shown me it's what he wants.
Yeah. Final question from Tim. How close do we think that Cromwell came to emigrating to the New World?
Thank you, Tim, because I had that in and I cut it because of time pressures. When he decides he's going to move from Huntingdon to St Ives, why does he choose to go to St Ives rather than anywhere else? And it's because he's going to be a tenant of Henry Lawrence. And who was Henry Lawrence? Apart from the fact everybody thinks, oh, Henry Lawrence is the man who later became president of the Council of State. So what was Henry Lawrence in 1632? And the answer is he's one of the 12 trustees of Connecticut. he was planning to relocate to Connecticut, and then he doesn't go in the end. Now, three separate sources which we don't think were aware of one another. In other words, it's not just copycatting. Three separate sources say that Cromwell got on a boat to go to New England, and Laud stopped the boat because he was at that stage on the committee for years. Laud wanted to get rid of all the nuisance, all the Puritans. Let's dump them in New England. Good riddance. But they then changed things. This is getting dangerously overblown over there. We'll stop it. That's true. I mean, all that's true. What we don't know is whether it's true that Lawrence, Cromwell, and others were on a boat to go to Connecticut, and they were stopped. Why didn't they go a bit later on when they could? Well, Henry Lawrence decides to go to Holland. So he goes off and sets up a radical Baptist church. So he's too radical for New England. They would never have tolerated him in New England, because he abandoned the belief in child baptism. Now, all three of those versions are written after the event, date it later. They date it either in 1641 in one case, and in two cases they date it roughly around the time of ship money judgment. I think there's a strong possibility that they were right about the attempt to get to New England, which was thwarted, but they got the date wrong, and the date was 1634, which is when Laud stops the boats going to New England. They think, when would Cromwell have gone? Oh, it would have been when, you know, the disaster of the ship money judgment in 1638 years. And I think it's, if you redate it, and there's the one which seems to be absolutely have the most information is by Cotton Mather in his book Magnalia Christi, published in the 1690s, and he's the son of one of the emigrants to the New World. Maybe nephew, but he's certainly in the same dynasty. And his account, if you just allow for the fact that he's got the date out of line, entirely fits all the known facts. So I think Cromwell might well, and I do think he's going to be with Henry Lawrence when Henry Lawrence himself had decided to go to New England. Is very suggestive. So I'm much more inclined to think that there's a strong possibility, and it would fit, of course, with this feeling that that everything had gone wrong, and he could go to where godliness would be valued. It makes perfect sense for me that Cromwell would want to go with somebody who could be his patron in getting him to New England. That it makes perfect sense to me.
It's interesting that it's sort of talk about going to Connecticut, because of course that's where then the three regicides who flee to America. So you know, Whaley Goth and Dixwell, that's where they all end up. Is Connecticut.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, so it becomes you know, freer than the Massachusetts. Massachusetts is more priest-ridden too.
Okay, I've got a contentious last question here. So Malcolm Raleigh, do you think the Cromwell of Ireland was this Oliver? It's sort of, you know, it's sort of, can we see the seeds of this in terms of what happens later in Ireland?
What really explains the later Oliver in Ireland is what happens in 1641 and 42. Let's say the massacres of thousands of Protestants by Catholics in the winter of 1641-1642, because Cromwell becomes obsessed with the consequences of that. And in 1642, he joins the committees which are organising the military repression of Ireland, the revenge for the massacres. And the programme that he takes over in 1649 is the programme which was abandoned in 1642 because civil war breaks out in England. So if you want to understand Cromwell in Ireland, you need to understand how deeply embedded he was in the horror stories of and exaggerated, of course, greatly exaggerated accounts of the massacres of the winter of 1641-1642, the entirely chose to believe.
And if you want to know more about that, Malcolm and Ollie, then I can recommend you look at our YouTube channel, because we did a brilliant video with John about a year ago, which you'll find on there, which goes into that in much more detail. So, oh right, sorry, less asking about Ireland and when he was appointed as an ensign in 1638. Have we got a
No, that's not him. That's another. I mean, that's been looked at. It's not. That isn't Oliver.
Yeah, Steve Murdoch looked at that. I think is in the 30 Years' War records. Yes, it's different to Cromwell, not the same one.
Not the same one. No, it's quite clear.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John. We'll do the silent round of applause in just a second. Just to remind you all, ladies and gents, for those of you who got season tickets or those of you who bought individual tickets for next week, Stuart Jennings, who is with us this evening, will be chatting next week about the experience of ordinary folk during the Civil War. So obviously the highest of the high today in terms of at least one of the most significant figures of the war.
Good luck, Stuart.
But next week, finding out the ordinary stories of folk based on Stuart's research in Newark. So otherwise, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and please give a huge round of applause to John for a brilliant talk this evening.